If we can speak of first causes, prime movers, My Lai is famous for one reason and one reason alone: Ron Ridenhour's courage and honesty and refusal to be complicit, and what he wrote in his letter to Congress, something dark and something rather dark and bloody. As David Halberstam said last year in introducing Ron at Dartmouth College, when you go into a combat zone, you look for one honest man. Ron Ridenhour is such a man. So let us welcome him.
I was drafted on March 23rd, 1967, 2 weeks to the day before my 21st birthday. It was a great surprise and a shock. I was a college student, probably about the same age as many of you at the time, and I thought that I had escaped the Army's clutches. Was I wrong? I went through basic training, and then advanced infantry training, and then parachute training at Fort Benning, Georgia, and finally in September of 1967 was assigned to a small unit at Schofield Barracks, Hawaii. When you went to Hawaii in 1967, you knew for sure that your next stop was Vietnam. That was just the way the war worked. Hawaii was the place where units went to build up before they deployed to Vietnam. I went and was assigned to the 11th Brigade. In a small detachment, 30 men, 2 officers, a handful of NCOs. We were supposed to be training for a commando type of role in Vietnam called Long Range Reconnaissance Patrol, LRPs, later be called Rangers. The task was to go out in teams of 5 or 6 men, be dropped by helicopter into the deep jungle, usually into what the Army thought would be a North Vietnamese Army concentration, and we would run around for 4 or 5 days until we got caught, whichever came first. Usually we got caught first. But I didn't do that right away. I trained for 3.5 months, and then just 2 weeks before the 11th Brigade was to ship to Vietnam, we were the last unit to go as a full unit. We were the last increment of the buildup. Our small detachment was disbanded. The infantry companies in the 11th Brigade were under strength, and the brass thought that they would cannibalize some of the smaller units which were less necessary and reassigned those soldiers to the infantry companies. 15 of our 30 enlisted men in this small unit were assigned to an infantry company, Charlie Company, 1st the 20th, which happened to be Lieutenant Calley's company, Captain Medina's company. And contrary to the Army's later claim that this was an incompetent unit, Charlie Company, 1st the 20th, was the advance unit for the 11th Brigade, which is to say that they were the infantry company which had done best in the various testing and training, and they were flown to Vietnam first to prepare the way for the rest of the brigade, doing various chores. The rest of us went by ship. I, meanwhile, had been trying to find out a little about the war. I knew nothing about it. I had worked full-time going through college and before that in high school, and just didn't have much time to learn anything about the war. I knew that there was controversy, but that was about it. In the weeks before we shipped to Vietnam, I scoured local bookstores, and finally there was hardly anything written in English on Vietnam at the time. There were a couple of books by a man named Bernard Fall, who was our reigning expert at the time, and I found those, bought them, and didn't have a chance to read them until we got on the troop ship. As we were plunging across the sea to Vietnam, I think a 17-day trip, I would go up on deck each day and read my books about Vietnam, Bernard Fall's version. It was a very, very different version than that which was being pushed to the public by our government. In Bernard Fall's view, Vietnam was a civil war, not a war of invasion. It was a war that the Vietnamese had already won once, and were now trying to win a second time to throw out, this time, the American imperialist as opposed to the French imperialists who had been there before. At least that was their view, and I must say it was Bernard Fall's view. So I'm crossing the ocean getting this sinking feeling, thinking, boy, oh boy, I don't like the sound of this. This is going to be ugly. And sure enough, it was. Once I got to Vietnam, I was assigned after about a week to a small light observation helicopter company. We had a couple of small helicopters, 3 of them in fact, which were the little sort of police bubble jobs. Pilot sat in the middle, passengers on either side, and generally these things were designed to ferry couriers from base to base and that kind of thing. But in Vietnam, They were adapted to another purpose called Aero Scouts, or hunter-killer. And we would fly out in pairs, first light and last light, and sometimes often during the middle of the day for a different purpose. The door gunners stood on the skid. We had machine guns, and we flew very low, 30, 40 feet right above the ground. One ship would fly over the other one, and we'd hedge hop. And we were looking for people with guns, first light and last light. We spent about 2 weeks training to learn how to do this, learn how to stand on a skid and not lose our lunch while we were doing so, hopping around, learning to shoot at things from this moving platform and hit them. We had, every fifth round was a tracer, and when you pulled the trigger on the M60 machine gun, it was like drawing a line to a target. It was pretty simple, actually. Our first mission came about 2.5, 3 weeks later, after we started our training. And we were to fly out and do what they called light air cover. There were 2 American infantry companies, a little over 100 men each, which had gotten on line, about this much space between each man, and as far as they would spread in either direction. And their task was to get on line and march across about a quarter of a mile of paddy into a fairly large Vietnamese village. I would say 150, 200 homes. Many of the homes were brick. It was a fairly well-established community. Our task was to fly over the village in advance of the advancing American soldiers to make sure that they weren't ambushed, to see if anybody was fleeing. Sure enough, we'd been there about 15 or 20 minutes. We're flying over the village, and we see a young man come out, sort of dart from hooch to hooch, making his way to the back of the village. And we followed him. Pretty soon, he broke out in the back of the village onto a path and started running away from the village, away from the American soldiers. We came down around beside him, hovered there as he's running along. And the door gunner on the other side, it was the other door gunner, not me on this time, is motioning to him, "Hey, stop, go back. This fella's having none of it, man. He's getting out of there. He is not waiting for us." So finally, the pilot, who was as green as we were, said to the door gunner, "Fire burst across the front of his path. Slow him down, make him realize that we mean business." So Brewer, the other gunner, fired a burst. But he hit him. Didn't get in front of him, he hit him. Hit him in the hips, and the guy went down like a sack of potatoes. Started to bleed. I mean, really started to bleed. You could see the blood, you could see the circle of blood around him just getting bigger and bigger. We're freaked out. I mean, we've never fired at another human being before. We didn't mean to shoot this guy, and we're all very upset. The pilot gets on the radio and starts calling to the infantry company, telling them to get down there, get around to where this fellow is and give him aid. And of course, they're on the ground and they're carrying packs, and it's a pretty good way. But they're trying, they're down there, but the pilot is very anxious, and he's suddenly getting on the radio, kind of getting at him, kind of digging him. Come on, what's wrong, come on. And you can hear the infantry officer, a lieutenant, who's got his RTO, his radio operator, with him. He's running, he's panting into the radio. We're coming. And you can see that he's getting agitated. Sure enough, a few minutes later, they break out, about 3 or 4 soldiers, onto the trail and behind the village, run down the trail to where the sky is laying. The officer runs up to him, kneels down to him very quickly, stands back up, pulls out his .45, cocks it, leans down, puts it next to his head, pulls the trigger. Boom! Kills him. He takes the radio, turns around, looks up at us and says, "This man no longer is in need of assistance." Hands the mic back to his radio man. And the message was clear. We're not here helping these people, we're here killing these people. Don't you guys get it? Well, to say the least, we were astonished, stunned, shocked, dismayed. Over the next 4 months, I spent 4 months in this helicopter company. Over the next 4 months, I saw similar events, I would guess, 5 or 6 times. And on several occasions, I had the opportunity to refuse to fire at people and did. This didn't sit well with the people I served with. But my view of it was, if they had guns, rock and roll, but if they didn't, gosh, they were non-combatants, or at the very least, our prisoners. And I refused to fire at those people. One day we were out patrolling. This was in I would guess early April, about 2 weeks after My Lai occurred, although I didn't yet know that it had occurred. We're out flying along, and I see, two men standing inside the mangroves on the edge of a mangrove swamp, which is out in the middle of a rice paddy. It's an amoeba-shaped growth of mangroves. At their tallest, they might get 8 or 10 feet high, but they're very thick, and they were surrounded by paddy, and I would suppose at the widest spot it might have been 50 or 60 meters across. We had a system by which if you saw something, you signaled the pilot, and he came around to your side. So I see these guys standing there. I tap his knee. He comes around. "What you got?" he says. "Got two men hiding in the mangroves." Okay. We fly around. I find them again. We hover above them. He says, "Get them out of there." So I'm waving at him. "Come on, you guys. Come on out. Come on out." They're having none of that. Over in the distance, maybe a quarter of a mile away, we can see a bunch of hooches burning, and there's an American infantry company over there. And, it stood to reason that these guys were hiding from them. The pilot says, "No, don't motion. Shoot him. Shoot him." So I shot into the rice in front of them, motioned for them to come out. And of course, they were not having any of that. They disappeared into the mangrove. Pardon me. The pilot was unhappy about this. Pardon me. He got on the radio and called the infantry company, told them what we had, asked them to come over. So they came over, they got online, and started to sweep through this mangrove swamp, started to walk through the mangrove swamp. They got about, I would guess, 30 or 40 feet in there, and there was an explosion. Boom, water comes up. In about a minute, 4 GIs come running out of there, carrying another GI who'd been wounded by a grenade. Sure enough, these guys were BC. So we back off, and we blow that mangrove swamp to kingdom come. I mean, the infantry company fires everything they have on it. We're making passes, shooting it up. They're calling in artillery. I mean, it went on for about an hour probably. We just blew that place to bits. That night, we go back to our base. And again, this is a small unit. We have about 30 enlisted men, 10 pilots. And we have a little club. And we go to our little club that night. And a debate breaks out. And the subject of the debate, of course, is, should I have killed these two guys when I had the chance? My position was they were unarmed. At least they had no arms that we could see. And I wasn't there to shoot unarmed people. It was me against everybody else, literally. I mean, we had a rip-roaring, screaming argument for about 3 or 4 hours. I had 2 friends who remained neutral. They abstained. They didn't come to my defense, but at least they didn't gang in. But it was really very intense. It was very intense. And one of the other door gunners made the statement, "I'll kill 1,000 gooks for every one of us that gets hurt." Oh, well, this guy is an idiot, So finally it ends and we go off. And the next day, we get up and we go out on a mission. In the middle of the day, we go out on another of these missions where we're supposed to fly off in advance of an infantry company which is out walking through the rural countryside there. And because we're doing what we're doing, instead of flying one over the other, we're flying in different circles away from each other, maybe a quarter, half mile away, whatever. At some point during the morning, we're out there for about 2 hours, maybe an hour and a half later, we hear the other ship. Rat-tat-tat-tat-tat-tat-tat-tat, M60 firing. In a moment, we hear over the radio, 1 VC, KIA, comes from the other ship. Okay, we fly around. And about 30 minutes later, the infantry commander radios us and says, "Thanks a lot, guys, we're home safe now. You can take off." So the other ship heads back to base. And we start to head back to base, but the pilot's a friend of mine, and I tap him like, let's check out that kill, man. Let's go see what happened over there. So we fly over to where we heard the machine gun firing. And there on the ground, in the courtyard of a single home, is a child, about 4 or 5 years old, shot dead. Clearly, the VCKIA. We head back to base. And by the time we get back, I'm in a full-blown bull goose loony rage. We hit the ground, and I'm out of that chopper. I throw away my machine gun, rip off my chicken plate, little ceramic vest we wore, and I'm running after the pilot of the other ship. His name is Levy. He's almost to the office, the unit office, which we call the TOC, Tactical Operations Center. He's about 30 feet from it, and I'm running towards him. I'm screaming, "Levy! When I get to him, he's literally shaking in his boots, and he's saying, "We didn't know it was a kid. We didn't know it was a kid." Well, I got to tell you, I didn't believe that. And we're face to face, and I'm screaming at him. I'm pounding his chest. These are strict no-nos, you know. Enlisted men do not do this to officers in the Army. But I was out of my mind. Finally, I don't know how it happened. Somebody pulled us off, and a couple of my friends took me over by the side and said, you know, I wanted to file charges. And they said, no, man, do not file charges. It won't do any good. There were 3 of them there. You weren't there. You don't know what happened. You'll lose. It won't be good for you. I said, I finally relented. I said, all right. I'm not going to file charges. I was grounded after that. The next day, the day after that, I'm not sure how long it was. A couple of weeks later, I was kicked out, booted, fired. The Army, in certain ways, is a lot like the civilian economy. You can be fired. And if you are, you just have to go out and find another job. I had to go find another job. And I had 3 options. I could go to headquarters, 11th Brigade Infantry Headquarters Company, and be a driver. But with my attitude, this was not a good idea. Or I could go to an infantry company, which I really didn't like the sound of. Their rate of attrition was 100% every 6 months. And if you didn't get wounded, you got some, dreadful malady or something. And it was just a bad place to be. Or I could go to the division long-range reconnaissance patrol company, the same kind of company I'd been training for in Hawaii. And I opted to do that. As I'm being driven to the headquarters company, I'm kicked out, and an hour and a half later, I got my bags packed, and I'm driving down to headquarters, which is about, a 1/3 of a mile away. We were assigned to a very large base, maybe 7,000 or 8,000 men. It was like a small American city. And I was going over to a different place in it. And as I approached the headquarters company, I see a team of LERPs in their full combat regalia, their tiger stripe camouflage uniforms, rigged for silent movement in the jungle, with their boonie hats and all that. And I know one of them. He's one of the guys that I had been with in Hawaii, who had gone to Charlie Company, and now obviously had been transferred in the same direction. I was going to the division LERP company. We had 1 LERP company per division. So I wave at him, he waves at me, and a few minutes later, after I get dumped and dump my stuff, I go over, I find him, and we go have a beer. And of course, we haven't seen each other a while, and we're going to talk to each other about what we've seen, our war stories. Hey man, what have you been doing? Hey man, what have you been doing? After a few minutes, he says, hey man, did you hear what we did at Pinkville? I knew about Pinkville. It was a village north of us, about 30 miles, I suppose, in an area that was supposed to be very hot. And this was supposed to be a hot area. I said, no, what'd you do at Pinkville? And he says, oh man, we went in there and we massacred all these people. We just lined them up and shot them down. It was a Nazi kind of thing. I said, yeah, well, what do you mean? How many? What are we talking about? He said, oh, I don't know, big village, 300-400 people, a lot. Everybody who was there, we killed them all. Hardly anybody survived. I said, well, why'd you do that? He said, well, we had orders. I mean, it took all morning. They could have stopped us at any time. I guess that's what you call an epiphany, what I went through at that moment. Because although I had seen a lot of murders, and I had even heard about a smaller massacre before, this was something on the order that was inescapable. And I had I don't even know how to describe it. I got really angry. I thought, boy, these no good sons of bitches, look what they have got us into. And I knew, without going any further, I knew that this guy was telling me the truth. I knew this was a true story. I just knew it in my gut. But I also knew that I couldn't just rely on his word, that, whatever happened, what if I was going to do anything. I didn't have a very well-formed idea of what I wanted to do, except to find out more about it and to complain, to do something, not to be a part of the crime. So I made up my mind that I would go and talk to my other friends who had been who had been in the unit with us in Hawaii and who had gone to Charlie Company, and several of whom had, since My Lai, transferred into the Division LERP Company. So these were people that I knew I could talk to. And as I went around later and talked to them one by one, I would find some time when we could be private, and I would just ask them the question, hey man, tell me what happened at Pinkville. What'd y'all do at Pinkville? And it'd be like Lansing the Boil. I mean, they'd just boom. It's just, boy, it just come out. They were compelled to talk about it. They couldn't believe that they had been there. They couldn't believe that it happened. They couldn't believe that they had played whatever role they'd played. And most of them had played some role. I had heard, Groover told me a really awful story about somebody I knew really well, who was my best friend in the service. We were drafted on the same day. We hooked up on the second day. We went through infantry training together, through basic and advanced infantry training. We had volunteered for special forces together, if you can believe that. And we had been accepted. We took all the tests. We'd been accepted, and we went to jump school together, headed for special forces. And both of us, although we went through the line at separate times, we got to a certain point at the line where somebody said, you're Ridenhour, sign here. Okay, what am I signing for? Oh, you re-up and you're extending your tour from 2 years to 4. I don't think so. So I refused to sign. Mike Terry did the same thing. He refused to sign. So instead of our next stop being Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where Special Forces training occurred, we went off to Hawaii to join the 11th Brigade. This kid was, I thought, truly the most decent human being I had ever known in my life. He was pure, noble, a good person. We ended up being assigned to the same LERP team. My first 5 missions that I went out on as a LERP, 4 of the men on that team had been in Charlie Company at Pinkville. On about, I guess, our 3rd or 4th mission, we had gone out to a place called Happy Valley and sat on a mountaintop or a hilltop and watched North Vietnamese soldiers come down a trail fully loaded for combat, making their way to a battle that was across the valley we could see. And this went on for 4 days, 5 days. And we'd see a group here, a group there, 30, 40, 50 at a time. They'd wind down the trail and wind around the hilltop 30 or 40 feet below us and disappear. 6 of us were out there, and we worked in 2-man shifts, 2 men on, 2 men on guard, and 2 men relaxing. Mike Terry and I were on the same shift, and we read books and chatted and stuff. We whispered. You whisper out in the jungle in those circumstances. Being quiet is important. Finally, we got picked up and came back to the nearest fire base and were dropped off because the helicopter that picked us up needed to go off and be used as a medevac for the battle that was going on. So we sat down and went and got in the chow line and talked to some of the grunts who had just come out of the battle. Then we went over and found ourselves a bunker, crawled up on top of it and laid down. And I asked Mike, hey man, tell me what you guys did at Pinkville. And his story was basically the same as everybody else's. Everybody had the same story, that they'd gone in there, they'd murdered all these people, and that Callie had been a pretty bad guy, but that the whole company was involved and that they were following orders. After Callie lined up all the people at the ditch and shot them down, many of them were mortally wounded but not dead. Mortally wounded people often make a lot of noise. People don't die easily. They don't give up life easily. So these folks in this ditch their limbs were flopping spasmodically, and they were moaning and groaning, and I guess that ditch must have been the source of a terrible racket. Well, my friend Mike and another friend sat down to have lunch a little after 11, not far from the ditch. And as they were eating, they just couldn't stand the noise. So at some point during their meal, they stood up and they walked to the ditch. One went to one side, one went to the other. And they walked up and down the ditch. And they took all the survivors that they could find one by one, and they finished them off. Pow, you take that one. Pow, you take that one. Pow. This was, I had been told by Groover and by a couple of other guys that Terry had done this. And I had to hear it from his mouth. And he believed that day, as he believes this day, that what he did was an act of mercy for those people in that ditch. That's what motivated him, he said, and what he still says today, and I think he believes it. And I think that if those people had been white Mormons, as he was, he would have had a different reaction at the ditch. But I wasn't there, and I don't know. After he tells me this story, though, I say, after a few minutes, Mike, Don't you know that was wrong, man? And he looked at me and he said, gee, man, I don't know. It was just one of them things. And he rolled over. A few minutes later, I could tell he was asleep. Over the next several months, whenever I heard that there was somebody around who had been in Charlie Company, who I knew who was maybe at the USO or someplace, I would go and track them down and I would ask them the same question. Tell me what happened at My Lai. And the story was always the same from each of their individual perspectives in the village. Big village, it was actually 3 small hamlets. And it took all morning, 4 hours to complete this task. During the morning, Charlie Company was one company of a 3-company unit called Task Force Barker. And contrary to the myth that has come down, that Charlie Company was there by itself, and that Callie was really there by himself and just his platoon somehow, all of the platoons of Charlie Company were in there. All of the officers, there were 3 other platoon leaders in addition to Callie, were engaged in directing their men to kill people, were participating in the killing of people. The company commander, Ernest Medina, went on trial for shooting one woman, which was witnessed by 3 different people who testified against him. And for some reason, the court-martial board chose not to believe them and chose to believe Medina, and he was acquitted. I thought my friends were honest and that they would probably, if I was able to get an investigation going, that they would probably tell the truth, but I couldn't be sure about that. I wasn't telling them what I was doing. I didn't tell them what was on my mind. This was considered dangerous information to have. And my intent, it was reasonable to deduce, might also be unwise. But finally, a few people knew what I was doing, and they knew the people in Charlie Company. One of them had been in Charlie Company and transferred out of the company just a week before the massacre. And he was also a very good friend and somebody I trusted and confided in, and he was out sort of bird-dogging people for me, and he'd tell me when somebody was around that I should talk to. Finally, with just 2 weeks left to go, he came to me and he said, boy, Michael Bernhardt is over at 2nd Surgical Hospital with jungle rot real bad, and you should go talk to him. Well, I knew about Michael. He had been in our unit in Hawaii, and he was a college guy, a smart guy. In some ways, he seemed out of place in Charlie Company, in our unit, and in Vietnam, because there weren't too many college people there. So I went and found him, and we sat and sparred for about 15 or 20 minutes until it became clear that we were on the same page, and we sort of revealed ourselves that we knew about this massacre, it sickened us, and that we wanted to do something about it. Well, Mike had a plan. When he got out of the Army, he was an RA, a volunteer, and he had a couple of years left. But when he got out of the Army, he knew the entire chain of command, from Lieutenant Callie all the way to the division commander, General Coster. And he was going to track them down one at a time and shoot them. Now, I don't think he really would have done that, but that's what was on his mind at the time. And I said, well, Mike, why don't we try my plan first? And he said, sure, what is it? And the truth was, I really didn't know. I said, well, I'm going to start an investigation. He said, sure, you know. I said, well, yeah, I got you. But maybe I can. And if I do, and I give them your name, will you tell the truth when they come to talk to you? He said, I actually think I asked him if he would back up my story. He said, I'll tell the truth. You tell the truth, I'll support it. I said, okay. A few weeks later, we were back in the States. I returned to the U.S. on December 2nd, 1968, after a full year in Vietnam, almost a full year, and went home, sat at the kitchen table, told my parents this long, awful story, wept, and announced my intention to do something about it, although I didn't know what. My father's reaction was very similar to the reaction that I got from other people, which was, shut up. You know, you don't know this is true, and it's none of your business, war as hell, these things happen, and the only thing that's going to come from it is that the government's going to mess with you for the rest of your life. And worse than that, they'll mess with me. You know, I wasn't hearing it, though. So I went out and talked to people, and my Boy Scout leader, various people I thought had provided me with my moral weather vane, that by which I knew that this was wrong and that I needed to act. And they were pretty much all in agreement. It was none of my business. I went to one friend, though, who had been my English teacher in high school and later my English teacher in college before I was drafted. He said, well, why don't you write a letter and tell what you know and how you came to know it and send it to the Army? I thought that was half good advice. I should write such a letter, but sending it to the Army didn't seem like a good idea. I thought they had a really large motive to cover this up. I didn't expect them to act. So I wrote such a letter. It was 3 legal pages long, about 2,000 words. It was quite specific. It said what I knew, how I'd come to know it, and asked for an investigation. It contained the grid coordinates of the village, the unit designations for the units I had been in, the unit designations of the units the other men had been in. It was, in short, a very good roadmap. If one wanted to investigate this event, this letter would be a good place to start. Since I've been doing this kind of work now for the last almost 30 years, myself as a journalist and doing a lot of investigative stuff, I know that it's not unusual to get calls from people or get letters, and people say things like, "Ooh, man, there's a lot of bad stuff going on in City Hall." Yeah, a little help? I know that. Can we have a little help here? A few specifics. And usually when you get tips, they don't include enough specifics, so you just can't act on them. This letter was something that anybody who looked at it could see that if they wanted to find out whether it was true or not, there was a way to do that. All you had to do was find these people and go and get them. I got a letter from them dated April 12th, and about 2 weeks after that, at the end of the month, an investigator from the Inspector General's office came and talked to me, brought a court reporter, read me my rights, and took my statement for about 2 hours. From there, he went off to interview the other men whose names were included in my letter. I believe there were 5 of them. Pardon me. And one of them was Michael Bernhardt. And the officer, of course, asked me to please keep this to myself while the Army worked through its investigation, and if it proved to be true, well, there would be a time for public disclosure, and when that time came, they would act, and it would all be all right. In the meantime, they needed to be able to conduct the investigation in private and without sort of the glare of publicity. I said, that's fine, go ahead. And 10 days later, I called Michael Bernhardt. I said, Mike, have they been to talk to you? He said, oh, yeah. I said, well, what'd you tell them? I told him the truth. I told him about the massacre. I said, okay. I called the colonel, investigating officer. I said, well, how's it going? He said, we're still investigating. It's not clear. We're still investigating. So at that point, I guess you would say my paranoia, my suspicions were confirmed, to me at least, and I became even crazier. I began to call this guy 2 or 3 times a week. I'd scream at him over the telephone that I knew he was covering up and that I wasn't going to let him do it and blah, blah. I was pretty nuts. I was pretty crazy. I was call and collect. And about halfway through the summer, he stopped taking my collect calls, so I started paying for them myself. And he would always counsel, patience, 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 patience. Meanwhile, Udall's office called in about August and said, the Washington reporter for our local paper would like to have this story, interview you. And I said, well, I don't know. I promised the Army, and they haven't really, we don't know what they're doing yet. I don't trust them, but we don't know what they're doing yet. Let's wait and see. So in early September, this colonel called me, and he said, well, we've arrested Callie. I said, that's fine. When are you going to arrest the rest of the officers who were involved up the chain of command? Because we had known that this was an order and that there had been command and control helicopters from all the levels of the AmeriCal division overhead that morning, that this was an operation, this was something that was intended, something that was planned. The colonel said, well, we're working on that, we're working on it. I said, okay, call me when you make a decision. 2 weeks went by, nothing happened, so I called Udall's office and said, send me that reporter. So the guy called me. I sent him a copy of my file, such as it was, a copy of my letter of complaint in correspondence with the Pentagon and with 2 or 3 congressmen and senators, and basically it just showed that this was something substantial, it was real, there was an investigation. He, of course, I'm sure, saw Pulitzer Prizes dancing in his head and was eager to write the story. He wrote the story and sent it off to his editors at the Arizona Republic, one of the most conservative newspapers in the country, and they, of course, chose not to run it. They weren't going to run this story, and so they didn't. Unknown to me, meanwhile, a man named Seymour Hersh, an investigative freelance reporter in Washington, had heard about it. His brother-in-law, who was an attorney, had gone to a party someplace in Washington, and at this party there was a general from the Army who had been working on the investigation. This general got a little loaded, started telling tales out of school. Oh man, you can't believe this investigation I'm working on, hundreds of people killed, etc. And the brother-in-law goes home and tells that to Hersh. Hersh, who is a very enterprising fellow, went to some place where he could look at all the old AP releases over the last several weeks and months, and he found the release on Calley. When Calley was charged, the Army issued a 3-paragraph press release which said, in essence, a lieutenant at Fort Benning, Georgia, has been charged with the murder of an undisclosed number of Vietnamese civilians. Well, of course, I think when everybody saw that, they thought, well, we're talking 2 or 3 here, and it was no big deal. It didn't draw any attention. Nobody realized we were talking about hundreds of people. Hersh flew down to Fort Benning, and in a really amazing feat of investigative journalism, spent 3 days tracking down Calley. Calley had been hidden away by the brass. He was not in any of the places that you would expect to find a first lieutenant back from Vietnam. He was a first lieutenant by now. He was instead billeted in bachelor's officers' quarters intended for generals and full colonels, not the sort of place you'd look for a lieutenant. Hersh finally found him, talked to Calley. Calley, who is no mental giant, but was not so dumb as to not understand what was about to happen to him, was glad to talk to Hersh. Calley knew that he was about to take the full weight of this responsibility. The Army was pressuring him very heavily to simply take a guilty plea, in which case there'd be no trial, no evidence, and it all would have gone away, and people probably or might not have heard about it after that point. At least I believe that was their intent. Hersh believes that was their intent. Hersh talked to Calley for several hours, went back to Washington, called Calley's attorney, talked to Calley's attorney, and then beat the bushes for 2 or 3 weeks, hoping to get more information, and drew a blank. So he did at that point what we all do when we reach that point. We all, I mean, being journalists do. He went with what he had. He wrote his story. And they sold it to, I believe, 33 newspapers. And it ran on November 13th of 1969 in these 33 newspapers. The editors at the Arizona Republic, meanwhile, saw those pieces, and they ran a piece the next morning in the Arizona Republic, which quoted excerpts from the letter of complaint and named me, and, you know, local boy rats out buddies was the headline, something like that. Hersh saw that. That piece then went out over the wire. Hersh saw that piece, called me in California, and the next day he was in California. And I gave him the same information I'd given the other reporter, and he said, "The thundering herd will be at your door tomorrow. Don't give them this. Give me a 3-day head start." And I didn't believe him about the thundering herd, but I was glad to give him a 3-day head start if they did show up, because he was the first guy there. He was the guy who had started this thing, had gotten it out into the public, and I could see that he was serious about tracking it down. Sure enough, the next day the thundering herd arrived. But Hersh went off and he wrote the next 3 stories that won him the Pulitzer Prize, broke the story wide open. Within about 10 days, the photographs that I guess most of you have probably seen some of appeared, and there was a special double session of Congress held in private, at which Congress and the Senate was given a briefing on the investigation. They were shown the photographs, and after those photographs surfaced, there was no going back. Somebody had to pay. The investigation ultimately spawned 3 investigations. There was the initial Inspector General investigation. At a certain point in the summer, I'm not sure of when, July or August, another Army branch, the Criminal Investigations Division, which is sort of like the Army's Detective Bureau, was assigned to do an investigation, and they began their investigation. And after the news became public, President Nixon appointed a special blue ribbon panel called the Peers Commission under a lieutenant general, a three-star general, William R. Peers, and their task was to investigate it thoroughly and to make. Nixon, of course, when he appointed this panel, promised the public, that when their investigation, the Peers panel investigation, was complete, all of their findings would be made public and their record would be fully disclosed. Peers completed his investigation in the spring of 1970. I guess it must have been in March sometime. And he recommended, I believe, that a total of 28 officers be charged. Soon thereafter, President Nixon decided that this would be a matter that must be handled by military courts and not by federal civil court, although the law allows either. And 2 weeks after Peers made his recommendations, about 25 of the officers that he suggested that he thought should be charged were mustered out of the Army and therefore put beyond the reach of military law. I couldn't believe these things were happening. You know, I really, it was sort of it's hard for me to describe how ill-prepared I was for this role. I just found myself in it and felt compelled to act and tried to. But watching it all unravel from the time that I wrote the letter till the time that it became public, and over the period of time that it was public, which was about 2 years, when this story was in one way or another on the front pages of America's daily newspapers, literally almost every day for 2 years, I watched in amazement as the cover-up was perfected. If you ask people today what happened at My Lai, most people, young people, don't even know about it. Older people, folks who were politically conscious and paying attention at that time, if you ask most of them, they would say, "Oh yeah, isn't that place in Vietnam where that lieutenant, what was his name, Kelly, something like that, went crazy and killed all those people?" Well, that's what the military wanted us to believe, but that isn't what happened. When the Army decided to go into My Lai, they sent the 3 companies of Task Force Barker. 2 companies formed what the military calls blocking positions, which is to say that they took positions on 2 sides of the village. If you imagine that it was inside a triangle, they took positions on 2 sides of the village, the purpose of which was to prevent people from fleeing from the advancing infantry company, Charlie Company, which came in from the other side of the village. 4 platoons in Charlie Company, and each of them, as they came into the village, they began to murder civilians. This took 4 hours, from about 7:32 or 3, something like that in the morning, until around 11:20. At 9:30, while the massacre inside My Lai was still going full scale, one of the other 2 companies in Task Force Barker, one of the blocking companies, peeled off and marched about 2.5 miles east to the sea, where they came to another village called My K 4. They commenced to slaughter the inhabitants of that village, a task which took all day. The number of people murdered at My K is still unknown. By the time Army investigators stumbled onto that, My Lai had been in the news for a long time, and the people who were in that second company had learned that it was really wise to have a very bad memory about what occurred that day, and most did have. So what happened at My Lai was not an aberration. It was not Lieutenant Cowley going crazy and just sort of orchestrating this whole thing by himself, but it was an operation. It was planned. The context was this. The Tet Offensive started, I believe, February 2nd of 1968. The My Lai massacre was March 16th, just 6 weeks later. The military's catechism about the consequence of the Tet Offensive for the Vietnamese was that it was a terrible disaster. And we have since learned that the Vietnamese also thought that. They had wasted a huge percentage of their cadre, of their oldest, wisest, most able fighters and political organizers and organizers of the revolution in the South. And it was the Army's thought that they were on the ropes. Now, we don't really know why they went into this village. We do know that they thought that it was the home base of a National Liberation Front Viet Cong fighting force called the 48th VC Main Force Battalion, and that this was the fiercest VC unit in our entire division area of operation. These guys were just bad. You know, they were very able fighters. Task Force Barker had been organized for the specific purpose of hunting down and destroying that unit. We also know that several people gave testimony to various investigators that what happened at My Lai was part of some larger military intelligence operation, but nobody ever discovered what it was or what the rest of it was, if there was any rest of it. But we knew that, one, they went in there to wipe out the 48th VC, and that it was part of some larger operation. My theory is that the Army and the intelligence agencies, concluding that the VC had made this terrible error with the Tet Offensive, thought that this was their opportunity to finish them off. And at My Lai, that's what they went in intending to do, to wipe out the home base of this unit. They thought My Lai was the home base of this unit. Well, it turns out, of course, that they were wrong. That didn't prevent the massacre from occurring. So, why do we care 30 years later? You know, what difference does it make? The Army's position has been that it was an aberration, not an operation, that it was not reflective of U.S. policy in Vietnam, and that it was one guy who went nuts. Well, the evidence suggests very strongly that it was far more than one guy who went nuts, that it was the whole unit, that it was, we know that the, should I say that the men I spoke to talked about the command and control helicopters from the entire division being overhead all morning or part of the morning. We know that the task force commander was overhead. There's no question about that in his helicopter. He was flying around. This took 4 hours. If it was an aberration, any of these people could have ordered a ceasefire at any time. The ceasefire was finally issued at 11:20, roughly 11:20 a.m., when Medina went running through the village ordering people to stop shooting. And guess what? They stopped shooting. You know, I mean, if this was what they claimed it had been, you would think that people wouldn't have stopped shooting, but they did. By that time, of course, there was no one left. About 4 or 5 people who had hidden, who had been covered by the bodies of their friends and relatives, or who had hidden in houses that had been burned, or had little places to hide under the floor of their houses or whatever. A handful of people survived in that way, but not too many. I think that this was not just a direct product of our policy of counterinsurgency in Vietnam, but an element of the strategy. Not to say that every American infantry unit that was in Vietnam went out and committed massacres, but that the annihilation of a village that was considered particularly intransigent was a tool in the military's toolkit. And when somebody decided that it was appropriate to use this tool in a certain place for a certain reason, they wheeled it out, and they did. I think that this very probably happened in a lot of villages throughout Vietnam in about the same time that it happened at My Lai. We don't know whether or not that's true because nobody's ever asked the question, nobody's ever gone to see if it's true. But I would like to know very much whether or not there were other great American victories in other villages around Vietnam which fit the order of battle profile that My Lai did, the order of battle being the military's assessment of the enemy's strength. The military has had in Vietnam an order of battle for every province and every district. They thought they knew what the units were what the enemy units were in each province, in each district. They thought they knew which villages were the home base of each VC unit. And I would like to know what happened to those other villages that fit the same profile as My Lai, which is to say other villages that were thought to be the home base of major VC units. We don't know the answer to that because nobody's ever gone and asked the question. Why does it matter today? I think it matters today in part because My Lai wasn't the last time this happened. It wasn't the last time it happened in Vietnam. It wasn't the last time this happened in the world. If you look at Central America, for instance, there were literally hundreds of My Lai-like massacres during the decade of the 80s when we were deeply involved there, and in which the only component of those wars that was not American provided, planned for, were the bodies of the people who were pulling the triggers. Everything else was ours. It was our strategy, it was our money, it was our training, it was our supplies, it was our guns, our bullets. And the pattern is really quite astonishing if you look at it. By 1983, the Guatemalan army was admitting that they had committed in just the last 2 years the massacres of 662 Indian villages. In El Salvador, the Salvadoran army was adopting the same pattern of counterinsurgency. Now, you need to understand what the basis of counterinsurgency is. Popular revolutions, peasant revolutions. The model was the Chinese Revolution, and Mao Zedong was considered to be the guru of peasant revolutions, people's armies. He had a famous aphorism in which he said that the people are the sea in which the guerrilla fish swim. Our strategy in Vietnam, and since, is that the way to defeat these guerrilla insurgencies, these peasant insurgencies, is to attack the peasant population because they are the logistical support base of the guerrillas. In Vietnam, we were literally trying to boil the sea off and leave only the guerrillas. And we would do that in all manner of way. I was at a symposium on My Lai in Indianapolis last week, at which there were two writers, Jonathan Schell, who's quite famous for having written two of the most important books on Vietnam. Early in the war, in 1967, he wrote a book called The Village of Ben Suc, a second book called The Military Half. And he, it turns out, wrote those books from the perspective of Quang Ngai Province, the same province in which My Lai resides. In 1967, he reported that 70% of the structures in Quang Ngai Province had already been destroyed by being put to the torch by American soldiers or by being bombed. Imagine 70% of the structures in Louisiana destroyed in a 2 or 3 year period of time. That's what we're talking about there. Another writer was Tim O'Brien, and he was in the same area in 1969, a year after the massacre. And he told stories that he was in an infantry company which literally patrolled through the villages of My Lai and My Khe where the second massacre occurred. And his company was ambushed on the edge of My Khe 4, where this massacre had occurred a year before, and suffered pretty serious casualties. And he has written a book, The Things We Carried, in which he describes this ambush. And he talked about how anytime they got fire from a village or in the vicinity of a village, this was 1969, this was a year after the massacre, even after the massacre was revealed. Anytime they got fire from a village, they would just back off, call in artillery and airstrikes, and the village would be flattened. The people weren't given a chance to believe or anything. They were flattened with the people in them. He said you could sit back there and hear the people screaming, pigs squealing, the whole works. This was the nature of the war that we fought. But more importantly, why should we remember it? Because it was the nature of the war that we then fostered in Central America, the wars we then fostered in Central America. El Mozote in El Salvador is the most famous of those, a village, really a series of villages that were fairly close together within a 10-mile radius. 764 people were massacred by the Salvadoran army, the Atlacatl Battalion, on December 8th of 1981. And when that was finally disclosed about 3 months later by a reporter from the Washington Post and a reporter from the New York Times, Raymond Bonner from Times, the Reagan administration's initial response was, it's not true, this didn't happen, etc. When later it turned out that it was true, they said, well, we didn't know about it, we couldn't have prevented it, etc. It turns out that the Atlacatl Battalion was a hand-picked battalion that was to be the model, the exemplar of our training methods and of our strategy there. And it was being trained by a cadre of American Special Forces soldiers. This cadre of American trainers stayed with this battalion until the moment they lifted off to go out to El Mozote and to massacre all these people. When the massacre was finished, the battalion came back and rejoined the trainers. The position of the government was, gosh, this was news to them, and certainly had nothing to do with design. The problem with that story was that the preceding October and November, the 2 months before, this same battalion had been involved in 5 other massacres of 5 other villages in which exactly the same pattern occurred. They were trained by their American advisors, went out and committed the massacre by themselves, came back, joined up with their American advisors, got some more training, went out and slaughtered another village, etc. How many massacres there were in El Salvador is unclear, as is it unclear how many exactly there were in Guatemala during this period of time, the decade of the 80s, but there were plenty of them. And it's hard to believe that our government wasn't witting and deeply involved. I mean, at a certain point, they could say, well, we didn't know, as they said after El Mozote. We didn't know. Or we couldn't control these guys. They're good old boys, but, you know, they get a little rambunctious sometimes. Well, that washes maybe after the first massacre, and maybe after the 10th, and maybe the 20th. But when there are hundreds of these events over a period of 5 or 6 years, at what point do our policymakers become culpable? At what point do they have to accept responsibility? At what point do you say, I don't believe your story, you know? The story that you come in and tell me of ignorance and good intentions. You know, if any of our children brought us a story like this about any series of bad behavior that they've been involved in, we'd know what to believe, you know. I ain't buying it. You know, but when it's the government, we have bought it for some reason. Now, let's flash forward to the last year in East Central Africa, a place called Zaire, now called the Congo, then called Zaire, in which there was, again, a peasant army sweeping out of enclaves in adjacent countries, sweeping across the country, and quickly taking it over, Zaire, which became the Congo. It later turns out, of course, that that army was trained, equipped, and supplied by us, by the U.S. Again, we have the same pattern. I don't know if you all have been keeping up with this. I keep up with these things. But we have the same pattern there again. An American trained, supplied, and equipped army sweeps through a country and leaves in its wake a string of massacres. Happened in this country also. Now, is our government behind this? I don't know. But it certainly is a disturbing pattern, and it seems to me one that we all ought to be concerned about. You know, this has been done in our names with our money. And, you know, each year we're still having trials of Germans, a few cases of Frenchmen, who were involved in the Holocaust. And every year we have pundits who write an article, a column, which says, won't those Germans ever get it? Will they never accept their responsibility? Well, it's an ugly parallel to make, but it seems to me that at a certain point in history, people are going to be looking at us and asking us the same questions. about our government's conduct in foreign lands. I'll take questions.
Why would they go about and, promote these kinds of
Why do they do
atrocities?
these things? Because it's the strategy that they've adopted, that they've unleashed in the world, actually,
To
because
what end, though?
to win the wars, and to support the governments that are in power that we support, our client states. I think it's pretty simple. It's terrible, but pretty straightforward in that regard.
'Cause I don't make that connection in some of these smaller countries where, what do we care? What's going on in Zaire or in Guatemala or...
Well, there's a good question there. I don't know the answer to what that is, but I can certainly look out there and see what the results are. There's no question of what the policy has been. Now, if you're saying that it's irrational, I might get behind that.
Yeah, it's what they do in the court. It's like you have to establish a motive if you want to make this case, and without a motive, it's like it is irrational.
Well, the motive has been to win. The motive has been to win. It's all been part of the Cold War, all part of the campaign to defeat communism and stomp out communism. And all of these people, each of these revolutionary movements was seen as a communist-inspired movement, and basically, when it came to defeating communism, there were no rules.
Okay, but that's even when you said this last one was last year, was it? And the Soviet Union collapsed, and communism hasn't been a threat since, what, 91?
As I say, I don't know that what happened in Zaire was that the massacres there were a part of our policy, or if they were just simply the law of unintended consequences, where we empowered a bunch of people who had, and armed and equipped a bunch of people who had their own motives and had deep-seated antagonisms, ethnic antagonisms for people they ran into. And it's unclear to me if what happened there was part of this longer range strategy. What happened in Zaire does not formally meet the criteria of counterinsurgency, okay? But what does match the pattern is it's an American-created and financed army, and you have the string of massacres in its wake.
Thank you.
Would you talk about the role of the School of the Americas? It's called the School of the Assassins. It's at Fort Benning.
Absolutely. Thank you. Part of the mechanism by which we have disseminated our view of counterinsurgency warfare is a place called the School of the Americas, which was originally located in Panama and existed in Panama from 1954, I believe, until 1986 or so, when it was thrown out of Panama by the Panamanian government. It is known popularly throughout Central and South America as the School of the Assassins. Some 60,000 Latin American soldiers and policemen, usually higher-ranking people, usually people at the company grade officer level or above, and NCOs, come to the School of the Americas, where they are taught the American way of war. And the American way of war, as far as the School of the Americas is concerned, is counterinsurgency, which is essentially a program in which people are taught to suspect their own citizens and to attack their own citizens, to think of their own citizens as potential terrorists and potential guerrillas. And the way it works out and has worked out in most of those countries is that if you disagree with the government, you become suspect. The School of the Americas teaches a whole battery of courses, all of which are about how to implement counterinsurgency within your own borders, how to make war within your own country against your own people. They have a whole series of courses that deal with psychological operations from the highest level of command to the lowest level of command. There were discovered in September of 1996, under a Freedom of Information Act request, the National Security Archives in Washington obtained a set of documents which showed that our government had been teaching these soldiers from Central and South America how to use torture as a regular part of the regime. They even had training manuals on teaching torture, and that those manuals were used in one form or another from at least 1982 until 1991, when they were apparently withdrawn. Now, has that training stopped? I don't know. Decommissioned. Among the documents that were forced out at this time, along with these training manuals, the actual training manuals were provided to the National Archives. And among the documents was a mention of something called Project X. Now, exactly what Project X is remains unclear, except that it involves training police and military in our client states how to use torture as part of an overall counterinsurgency strategy. That program began in 1963 and continued in one form or another at least until 1991, when these manuals were discontinued. This program has popped to the surface briefly in various places along the way. I think 1972 or 3, it was disclosed that an Immigration and Naturalization Service school, of all things, in Texas, was receiving dozens and dozens of officers from Latin America, and that they had a torture training manual. In 1983, there was a manual that popped up down in Nicaragua that was provided to the Contras by our CIA. It also taught torture and assassination as an element of implementing their insurgent warfare against Nicaragua. Again, in 1988, there was testimony in private by a high-ranking CIA officer who said that, yes, indeed, it turned out that in the late 70s and early 80s, the CIA had, in fact, been out sponsoring the other sets of torture training and torture manuals. Then this latest disclosure about the torture manuals used at the School of the Americas. There's a fellow by the name of Roy Bourgeois, who, a Maryknoll priest, who has made it his business to expose the School of the Americas, and he has been carrying on this campaign for, I guess, about a decade now. And I suppose you've probably seen various references to him in the paper from time to time when he's about to go off to the pokey again for having done some demonstration at Fort Benning, where the School of the Americas now is. He's been leading the fight to expose the school and to have it closed down, and there's some movement in Congress now. There's kind of a growing movement in Congress to close it down. But if experience is any teacher, it won't mean the end of these programs. It will just mean that they'll be shifted someplace else, and it'll be another decade before we find out where they are.
Back to the issue, if there were other massacres in Vietnam, with the opening up of Vietnam since 1988, Domori, is there a way to get research or information from them as to what their side of the story as to other massacres might be, since you find looking in that area from this side of the Pacific to be closed?
I don't think so. I was there in 1977, and 2 years after the end of the war, I went back with a delegation of people to, make a donation of some money for a hospital at the site of My Lai, the Vietnamese being clever folks. Took our money, thanked us very much, and then built a hospital in a central location in the province. But I was there anyway, and we talked to people. I talked to people at sort of official levels, and they didn't know what I was talking about. And I talked to people at lower levels, less official levels, who told me stories of massacres, also in two other massacres, also in Quang Ngai province, that I had heard of each time that I was in Vietnam. I was in Vietnam when Calley was convicted. I returned to Vietnam in 1970, spent the entire year there, 70 to 71, summer to summer. And that's where I began reporting. I worked for Time magazine. And when I was there that year, I heard these stories of these massacres. A village of 900 people very near My Lai, in the Batagan Peninsula where My Lai was. It is alleged, I heard this story in 1968, in 1970, and again in 1977. All from different individuals, and at the very least, it is a live and active myth in Vietnam if it's not true. But the story was that a contingent of U.S. Marines who were in that area at the time and South Korean soldiers who were in that area at the time, rounded up a village of 900 people, put them on naval landing craft, and those landing craft headed out to sea. When they got far enough out to sea, the people were simply thrown overboard. I don't know if that's true, but it's a story that I heard consistently, and the details were the same each time, and it came from different people. Will the Vietnamese government disclose what it is that they know about American atrocities, further American atrocities in Vietnam? I doubt it very, very much. They want very badly to be reincorporated into the international economic mainstream, a place that they've been shut out of for ever since the end of the war. They're only now starting to get back into it. And we have the ability as a nation to do them great harm or to do them great good in that desire of theirs. They're not going to injure themselves with it. Their view is that the war's over. We won, so what?
Thank you.
It's my understanding that at the time that the My Lai story broke, that the public was shocked and outraged, and it seemed by the time that Callie was sentenced, that public sentiment had changed entirely. Is that your perception of what happened, and if so, to what do you attribute that mass change of heart?
You know, I haven't seen the polling information in a really long time, and I can't really answer that part of your question, but it's my perception that people thought Callie was scapegoated. Now, how we can put these two contradictory understandings together, that on the one hand most people thought he was scapegoated, and on the other hand a few years later most people thought that he was the only one, I can't explain that, but I believe those to be real phenomena in each case.
You were talking about ways, instances where the U.S. government has continued to use the same strategy as they used in My Lai, and I was wondering, what do you see, how do you see it being different in the more contemporary cases like Guatemala or El Salvador?
Well, the way that it's different is that when Nixon came into office, he said he had a plan to end the war. And what we now know, of course, that his plan to end the war was a plan to win the war. But part of that plan also was something he called Vietnamization. And by Vietnamization, he meant, this was the Nixon doctrine, by Vietnamization, he meant that we would continue to wage these wars exactly the same way in every way with one exception, and that is that we would take American boys out of the field and that they would no longer be the trigger pullers. We would still supply everything, you know, the weapons, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, everything right down the line. So the Nixon doctrine was about more than just Vietnamization, but was about, I guess you would call it, the globalization of Vietnamization, which this policy became the policy for our participation in these kinds of conflicts everywhere, not just in Vietnam, but everywhere. So that when you get to Central America, this is what you have. You have exactly the same policies, the same tactics, the same techniques, the same tools, same technology, American money, everything, but you have brown boys pulling the triggers on brown women and kids. That was the change, and that's the pattern worldwide.
Thank you, Ron. Another great presentation, and thank you all for coming out. And it was a great group. Thanks a whole lot.